All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're going to tackle a really complex question, and we're going to use a pretty fascinating text as our guide to do it. So here's the question. Is Islam a religion without symbols? You've probably heard this idea, right? That Islam came to just wipe the slate clean of all that stuff, to purify belief from any physical objects. And, it's a concept that, weirdly enough, reminds me of something from pop culture. Yeah, kind of like the faceless men from Game of Thrones who are all about erasing identity for this higher, formless principle. But, and this is a big but, the source material we're digging into today says that this whole view is, well, a fundamental misunderstanding, at least from one very specific theological perspective. Okay, so let's get into it. First things first. To really get what this argument is saying, we absolutely have to understand the rules of the game, so to speak. We need to know the exact framework for interpretation that the source text is using. It's a very, very specific lens. And the source is super clear on this. Its conclusions are drawn only from two places: the Quran, as interpreted by the Prophet's family, the Ahl Bayt, and the authentic traditions or hadith from the infallible imams. What's not on the table? Any kind of analogical reasoning, what's known as qiyas. And another key principle, narrations have to be presented in their complete form. So you have to remember this framework because it is absolutely crucial for everything else we're about to discuss. Okay, so we've got our framework. Now, where does this argument actually start? You might think it'd be with rituals or specific objects, but nope. It begins with the very fabric of creation itself. The key, according to the text, is this one Arabic word, ayat. Now, ayat is fascinating because it means two things at once. It's a verse in the Quran, but it's also a sign or a phenomenon out there in the natural world. So think about that. If both the scripture and the universe are made of signs, then getting rid of symbolism isn't just cleaning house, it's like trying to silence creation itself. It would strip the world of its whole God-given purpose, which is to be a system of signs pointing to something greater. And this verse from the Quran just nails it. We will show them our signs, ayatina, in the horizons and within themselves, until it becomes clear to them that it is the truth. See? It perfectly illustrates the core idea. The universe isn't just random, meaningless matter. It's a giant message board, a billboard of divine signs, all pointing back to one single source. Okay, I know what you're thinking, but what about idols? I mean, the Quran's condemnation of idolatry is one of its most famous teachings, right? Well, this is where the argument gets really sharp. It makes a super important distinction between honoring a sacred sign and worshiping an idol. And you can see that distinction right here. The source draws a really bright line in the sand. On one side, you have shirk. That's the forbidden act. That's when you worship symbols as if they have their own independent power, or you treat them as go-betweens to God. But on the other side, you have taqwa, or piety. And that's about honoring symbols that have been specifically appointed by God. Doing that is seen as an act of faith. So the problem isn't the symbol, it's what you do with it and where you think its power comes from. And it goes even further. The text argues that the Quran doesn't just, begrudgingly allow for symbols. No, it says the Quran actively commands that certain very specific symbols be honored. And there's a term for this, Sha'air Allah. This is a Quranic term that's absolutely central to the whole argument. It literally means the symbols of God. These are the officially sanctioned signs and markers whose veneration is actually considered an act of piety. And the text then lays out a whole list of them, pulled straight from scripture and tradition. I mean, just look at this list. You've got places like the two hills in Mecca, Safa and Marwa, which are explicitly called symbols of God. You have the sacrificial animals for the Hajj, also called symbols of God. Then there are objects with history, like the Ark of the Covenant, or even the coat of the Prophet Joseph. And it even extends to personal relics, like the prophet's hair or cloak. So what the source is doing here is building a powerful case that God himself sets aside or consecrates certain physical things to be focal points for our devotion and remembrance. Okay, so this brings us to a really famous and powerful case study that kind of ties all these ideas together. We're talking about the black stone in the Kaaba, and specifically an incident involving it that, according to this source, usually only gets half told. Now, you might have heard this statement before, attributed to Umar ibn al-Khattab. He says, "I know you're just a stone that can't help or harm. If I hadn't seen the messenger of God kiss you, I wouldn't kiss you." And this quote gets used all the time to argue that the stone has zero intrinsic value. It's just a rock, and the only point is to imitate the prophet. But the source we're looking at says, hold on, there's more to the story. So, the big question is that the complete story? Well, according to the traditions cited in our source text, that was not the end of the conversation, not by a long shot. Someone else was there, and they were about to chime in. Right, so our source provides the full narration from Shia texts, and the crucial part is what happens next. In this complete version of the story, another major figure in early Islam, Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib, steps right up and corrects this understanding right then and there. His response is direct. Rather, it does benefit and it does harm. Wow, a total correction. And then Ali explains, according to this narration, why. He says the stone isn't just a stone, it actually holds a divine covenant, a promise taken from all of humanity way back at the dawn of time. And on the Day of Judgment, it's going to bear witness. This just completely reframes the whole thing, right? It goes from being a simple ritual marker to a sacred symbol with a deep, ongoing cosmic function. So let's step back for a second. We've looked at the framework, the scriptural evidence, and this really important case study. What's the big takeaway from this particular point of view? The argument concludes that Islam's role was never to create some kind of faceless religion. Instead, it was about purifying and reorienting that natural human need for symbols towards the divine. So instead of abolishing symbols altogether, this view says Islam's job was to tear down the false, man-made ones and to elevate and sanctify the true, God-appointed ones. It gives them a sacred purpose that always points back to God and never, ever away from Him. And all this leaves us with a final, pretty powerful thought to chew on. What else might look different when we actually make a point to seek out the complete story? Challenging a common assumption, especially when you dig up the full context, can reveal a reality that's so much deeper and more nuanced than we ever imagined. Thanks so much for joining this explainer.